Casey Sizlakowski wrote in and said, Colin, last weekend on the Mario 3 episode of Knockback, which is our retro nostalgia podcast, you said people graduate from Nintendo. You also said something to the extent that Nintendo isn't for you because it's the same thing over and over and you like new experiences. However, aren't Sony's games the same things over and over again? While they may have newer IPs, they are all the same game, over-the-shoulder third-person action games. Couldn't you make the argument that Sony's games are all the same except for a change of setting and tone? I don't know if that came through, but
wow,
that's what I think of that. Yeah, give that a boost. That's an unsavory one here in the room. I'm gonna tell you that. But that's what I think of that. I think Sony is being known for a certain type of action game, and we make fun of them for that all the time here on this show. But I don't think that you can compare Nintendo to Sony. And I was saying this about Nintendo, and I finally got to talk about them in a really deep way on the Mario 3 show without being like just out of pocket and having a place to actually talk about it, where I kind of articulated that the reason that Nintendo is very, I keep saying Nintendo is like Disney. They're embracing that they're becoming like Disney. They're a generational company. And the reason that they can really kind of milk the same things over and over again, that Animal Crossing feels so new, even though Animal Crossing came to GameCube 20 years ago, for instance, right, is because they get new people all the time, new kids being brought up by both Nintendo adults, but also just by the normal course of being exposed to Nintendo the same way we were as children. I grew up on the NES and SNES, and these kids are growing up on Wii U and Wii and Switch and all of the rest. And so I don't think it's a bad thing to graduate from Nintendo. I don't think all people do graduate from Nintendo. In fact, I think the numbers suggest that a lot of people don't graduate from Nintendo. But I think comparing the two is quite strange to me. If anything, I think Sony has been in some cases, especially earlier on, maybe too insistent on moving on from some things. And if you really go in and look through some of the IP that still goes on to this day, that's from the very beginning, you'd have to go to Gran Turismo and be like, that's the only franchise that Sony really still supports to this day in any way, shape, or form that comes from the original PlayStation. Otherwise, what's from the PS1 that you give a shit about? And then you go to PS2 and it's like God of War. Okay, and that's, by the way, late in PS2's life cycle. Gran Turismo was about halfway through. Not a little, maybe not halfway through. That's a dramatic. That's too dramatic. I'm gonna recant that. So I just think that, are they returning to the well sometimes a little too much? Yeah. Am I afraid Insomniac's becoming the Marvel studio? Could be. Don't really know what's going on with that yet. Don't want too much of that. Am I afraid that Horizon's about to get nailed into the ground by 17 different studios at the same time? Like the blonde girl on the black couch, surrounded by those big black men. That's Horizon right now. And am I afraid that that's going to be bad for Horizon? Yeah. But generally speaking, when you think about it, like, they probably could have run Uncharted into the ground a lot more than they did. They definitely could have brought Jak and Daxter back a million different times. You look at something like Ratchet and Clank, and that's kind of persevered but gone away. I mean, I don't, unlike God of War, which has persisted in some way, Ratchet and Clank kind of went away. It had like a period where there were games that are either coming out that no one cared about, really during the PS3 era, or after a crack in time specifically, or there's just some vacancy there. But even that kind of like stayed around. But my opinion, and I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, and Dustin, we can go to you first, is that I think Sony has shown a propensity to move on. That's why I think it's that's why it's a question if they're going to make The Last of Us Part 3. That's why it's a question that, although they are going to make Ghost of Tsushima 2, right? It's like, we don't actually know. While when the next Zelda comes out, there's certainly going to be another Zelda. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's no question about that. And I think that's wildly different. I don't look at any Nintendo game as final, ever. Even Pikmin's not final. Even Advance Wars isn't final. Animal Crossing, Metroid, it just never ends. And I think that's literally, it never ends. And some people love that, but I don't. Dustin, what do you think?
Casey tried really hard to come at you, Colin, with the ammo of the Sony first party games. Not the right move.
He didn't expect me to fart.
They got to understand that Colin has graduated from Nintendo to games with a lot more variety, like Far Cry every year. So think about that. Just think about that.
There is, I will say too, I think Casey is ultimately wrong, but I do think he has a point as far as modern Sony goes. because we know they're making The Last of Us Part 3. Like we know.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty obvious. And it's even more obvious now that and this is, to be fair, a more modern turn than Sony is used to taking. But I mean, we're getting Twisted Metal back, and milked in more ways than one. Like, because now we see these IPs being thrown into the television and movie space in a way that we hadn't really seen prior. In fact, they're the first ones to do it. Really, Nintendo just did their Mario movie, but we had Uncharted already. We're about to have Twisted Metal. I would imagine Ghost of Tsushima 2. Yeah, Gran Turismo. Ghost of Tsushima 2 is on its way, I think we can safely say, because it was successful. And
we know Ghost of Tsushima is on its way. I think the John Wick dude's writing it. Like, right? Isn't that
right?
Yeah.
But what I mean is, I think success of an IP now in the PlayStation ecosystem, it does kind of raise that question of like, will this go away? Because I think it's safe to assume that Uncharted is not done. I think it's safe to assume that we've probably not seen the last of Ratchet and Clank either. Like, I feel like it's a very different Sony, where like I feel like a while ago you could have had like, here's one, and then off we go, or here's like a solid trilogy, and then off we go. I feel like modern Sony is a lot more like Nintendo than maybe they've been in the past. And I'm not saying that, I don't even necessarily think that's a bad thing, by the way. But there's definitely a difference in attitude to modern Sony versus, the Sony of the PlayStation 2 or the PlayStation 3.
I think so. I also think that a lot of that comes from the fact that games just didn't sell like they did back then, like they do now.
100%.
Like
1,000,000%.
Sony had no games in the PS2 era that sold like they did in the PS3 era, and no games in the PS3, and then just raising the bar from 5 million to 10 million to 15 million to 20 million to 25 million. And so of course you're going to go back, and especially with the cost and increased cost in making these games, you're absolutely right. I think what people mistake with my analysis of the Nintendo is that obviously they're very good at what they do, maybe the best at what they do. I also think they're kind of in their own land, for better or for worse, doing kind of their own thing. I don't think they really care what's going on in the rest of the industry. I think that's kind of fun. What's fun about them. And I think that they're finally embracing their multimedia potential, which is what's going to make them like Disney. They're going to be Nintendo's, for as big as Nintendo is right now, I think Nintendo's only going to get bigger, and which is incredible. And it's just, they're such an old company. And even in gaming, they've been around for a long time, and they just kind of got scared away. And I think Dagan and I talked about this on the Mario 3 knockback, where I was like, they did try a Mario movie 30 years ago. They did have their TV shows like Captain N, and they did have all these sponsorships on Nickelodeon, and like they kind of just got scared off. And it was very weird. And they kind of ceded the entire 90s basically to, or at least from 95 onward, to PlayStation. And they're really back in their prime, and I'm really impressed by it. But there's no denying that it's still Mario, it's still Mario Kart, it's still Smash Brothers, and that there are some new ideas. Like no doubt there are new things that come out, but like, what is the new relevant thing? I would say Splatoon, probably the newest IP, probably, which is from the last console, right? So that's my point. And I don't. It's funny you bring up Uncharted though, just as a brief exit here. It is funny that Sony blatantly teased a new Uncharted game, and then it just kind of came and went. We're just in a different situation right now. Like it's no more. It couldn't be any more blatant. If that's not Uncharted, then there's some corny ass replica of Uncharted in development that no one wants. So that's obviously Uncharted. It's funny that kind of came and went.